The history of slavery and the complex dynamics surrounding interracial relationships are deeply rooted in the evolution of European exploration, colonization, and the establishment of racial hierarchies. Slavery as an institution has existed in various forms for millennia, but it took on a particularly racialized dimension beginning in the late 15th century, when European powers ventured beyond their borders, encountering African, Asian, and indigenous American populations. As European explorers and colonizers began to carve out vast empires in the Americas and other parts of the world, the notion of race became an essential tool for justifying conquest and subjugation. Before the transatlantic slave trade solidified race as a primary factor in the enslavement of Africans, slavery in the ancient world was generally based on military conquest, debt, or social class, and enslaved individuals came from a variety of ethnic and racial backgrounds. In classical civilizations like ancient Rome and Greece, slavery was a widespread institution, but it did not rely solely on the concept of racial difference. It was only in the early modern period, as European nations began to expand their imperial reach, that race began to be used as a primary marker for enslavement and social status. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European explorers from Spain and Portugal made contact with Africa, marking the beginning of a centuries-long process of enslaving millions of Africans. The capture, transport, and enslavement of Africans, who were often considered subhuman by European standards, were justified by emerging racial theories that placed Africans at the bottom of a supposed racial hierarchy. These racial theories were intertwined with ideas of religious and cultural superiority, as well as economic motivations. By dehumanizing Africans and portraying them as an inferior race, European colonizers could rationalize the brutal institution of slavery and their exploitation of African labor in the Americas. The African slave trade quickly became an integral part of the global economy, fueling the agricultural plantations of the New World with labor. However, the racial divide created by the enslavement of Africans went beyond economics. It created an enduring cultural and social taboo around interracial relationships. Early European settlers in the Americas, particularly in the English, Spanish, and Portuguese colonies, were confronted with the realities of a multiracial society composed of Europeans, Africans, and indigenous peoples. As the racial hierarchy solidified, the social, legal, and religious systems of these colonies began to reflect a deep discomfort and hostility toward interracial unions, especially those between Europeans and Africans. The institutionalization of slavery in the Americas developed gradually as European colonizers sought to establish control over the vast lands and populations they had claimed. Initially, the Spanish and Portuguese attempted to enslave the indigenous populations they encountered in the Americas, but the indigenous people often succumbed to European diseases or escaped into the surrounding wilderness. As a result, European powers began to rely more heavily on African labor to meet the labor demands of the growing colonial economy. In the English colonies, the development of slavery followed a similar trajectory. In the early years of English colonization, labor was provided primarily by European indentured servants, who worked for a set period of time in exchange for passage to the New World. However, as demand for labor grew and indentured servants completed their terms of service, planters turned to enslaved Africans as a more permanent and reliable labor force. The legal and social framework of slavery began to take shape in the early 17th century, with the passage of laws that codified the status of African slaves as property. The racialization of slavery in the English colonies became increasingly pronounced over time. By the mid-17th century, laws were being passed that explicitly linked slavery to race, making it clear that Africans and their descendants were to be enslaved for life, while European laborers remained free after completing their terms of service. This racial divide was further reinforced by laws that prohibited interracial marriages and relationships. These early laws laid the groundwork for the rigid racial hierarchies that would come to dominate colonial society, shaping not only the institution of slavery, but also social and cultural attitudes toward race and interracial unions. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, slavery had become deeply entrenched in the social and economic fabric of the British, French, Spanish, and Portuguese colonies. The African slave trade continued to grow, with millions of Africans being transported to the Americas to work on plantations, in mines, and in other industries. The racial distinctions that had been introduced in the early years of colonization were now firmly established, and the institution of slavery was inseparable from the concept of race. The racial hierarchies that develop alongside the institution of slavery were not only enshrined in law, but also deeply embedded in the cultural and social attitudes of the time. European colonizers viewed themselves as superior to the peoples they had conquered and enslaved, and these beliefs were reinforced by religious doctrines, pseudoscientific racial theories, and cultural representations of race. In European societies, particularly in the context of the Enlightenment, the emerging scientific discourse began to categorize human beings into distinct racial groups. European intellectuals like Karl Linnaeus and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach sought to classify humanity into various races based on physical characteristics such as skin color and skull shape. These racial classifications were hierarchical, with Europeans placed at the top and Africans at the bottom. These ideas became increasingly influential, providing a veneer of scientific legitimacy to the belief in European racial superiority. In colonial societies, these beliefs were translated into social norms and practices that strictly regulated interactions between people of different races. Interracial relationships, particularly those between white Europeans and enslaved Africans, were viewed with suspicion and hostility. Such relationships were seen as a threat to the social order, as they blurred the boundaries between the races and challenged the rigid racial hierarchies that underpinned the institution of slavery. The fear of racial contamination was particularly pronounced when it came to the offspring of interracial unions. In colonial societies, the children of mixed-race unions, often referred to as mulattoes, mestizos, or other racialized terms, occupied a liminal space in the racial hierarchy. While they were often treated as inferior to whites, they were sometimes granted privileges denied to full-blooded Africans or indigenous peoples. This ambiguous status posed a challenge to the rigid racial order, leading to the implementation of increasingly strict laws to prevent interracial relationships and to control the status of mixed-race individuals. Religion played a complex and often contradictory role in shaping attitudes toward interracial relationships during the era of slavery. On the one hand, both Catholic and Protestant denominations provided theological justifications for slavery, particularly in the context of European colonialism. Religious doctrines emphasized the moral and spiritual superiority of Europeans, often framing the enslavement of Africans and indigenous peoples as part of a divine mission to civilize and convert these populations to Christianity. At the same time, religious teachings also emphasized the importance of sexual purity, marriage, and family as sacred institutions. In this context, interracial relationships, particularly those between white Europeans and black Africans, were seen as transgressions of the natural and divine order. Religious leaders often condemned interracial unions as sinful, framing them as violations of both racial purity and moral decency. However, there were also moments of resistance and subversion within religious communities. Some Christian missionaries, particularly in the early years of colonization, viewed enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples as spiritual equals who deserved to be converted and integrated into the Christian community. This perspective sometimes led to a more tolerant attitude toward interracial unions, particularly in Catholic colonies where the Church played a central role in regulating marriage and family life. In the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, for example, the Catholic Church played a significant role in legitimizing interracial marriages, particularly between European men and indigenous or African women. These unions were often formalized through religious ceremonies, and the Church's recognition of these marriages provided a degree of legal protection for the women and children involved. However, even in these cases, the racial hierarchies that underpinned colonial society remained intact, and the offspring of interracial unions often face social and legal discrimination.